Welcome, everyone, to Christian Formation at Church of the Redeemer and to the series on the moral courage of the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. This session, number 6, focuses on King in Vietnam in the early part or the early months of 1967. Remember, his public ministry and advocacy was over a 13-year period, 1954 to his assassination date in early April of 1968. And he was traveling constantly, meeting thousands of people. So we can't cover everything that King said or did. You have to be selective. And so there are important events in his life that are not being covered in this series, but certainly merit attention. If you're an older person, as I am, and you were old enough in 1967 to be socially aware, you may remember that 1967 was the year that the mood of the American people toward the war in Vietnam began to change. Even though President Lyndon Johnson was a Texan, and remember Texas was one of the states of the Confederacy in the American Civil War, he and King still were arm in arm in the quest to remove from black Americans, and in the 1960s the phrase was Negros, the shackles of segregation and injustice which derived from that Civil War. King had criticized the Vietnam War. He had spoken against it several times from the pulpit of his church, Ebenezer Baptist in Atlanta, but that was in church and not in a more public venue. And I believe he didn't really speak in the strongest terms he could have used or actually believed. King was constantly given advice by his staff and others that if he openly and publicly criticized Johnson and the war, which at this point still had support in our country, he would risk losing the support of the American people for the freedom movement or civil rights movement. Criticizing a war does have repercussions. If he lost the support for the civil rights freedom movement, segregationists would then again be encouraged to seek ways to perpetuate anti-black and whites-only policies and practices, regardless of all the gains that have been made in the new federal laws outlawing various kinds of segregation. Here's one of King's biographers, Taylor Branch, describing America in late 1966 and early 1967. There was a sharp political backlash that countered the gains that had been made in 1963 and 65. Georgia elected a novice governor, a restaurant owner named Lester Maddox, who was known for defying the new civil rights law by chasing away black customers at gunpoint. He denied any racial animus or appeal, as did Ronald Reagan, who won the California governorship after opposing both major civil rights acts in 1964 and 5. President Johnson, in the midterm elections of 1966, suffered heavy reversals. He groaned privately, "I think the Negros lost it," fretting that the backlash would move beyond George Wallace and become respectable. There was sensational violence in the news. A serial killer in Chicago strangled 8 student nurses in their dormitory. An ex-Marine climbed the University Tower in Austin, on the campus of the University of Texas, and shot 35 strangers. I remember that, the Texas Tower Massacre. Grim stories suffused popular culture. Truman Capote's best-selling In Cold Blood and the gangster film Bonnie and Clyde. Branch quotes a line from the movie. "They're young, they're in love, they kill people." All along captured on, this is the more important part, all along captured on film for television broadcasts. And those of us who were aware then remember the evening news. War came home from Vietnam. Weekly U.S. casualties reached 1,200 by January of 1967 and exceeded 2,000 a week by the end of March, with carnage tenfold higher for the Vietnamese. King's first anti-war march occurred on March 25 in Chicago. On that Saturday morning, King and a noted pediatrician of that time, Benjamin Spock, I remember, led 5,000 demonstrators through downtown Chicago and then to the Chicago Coliseum, and King was reported as having said, "We must combine the fervor of the civil rights movement with the peace movement." I mentioned earlier the risks posed to the support of the freedom or civil rights movement by the growing anti-war movement. In particular, was the risk of financial support for the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, which King led and which was the instrumental organization in organizing demonstrations across the South. But King said, quote, "At times you do things to satisfy your conscience, and they may be altogether unrealistic or wrong tactically, but you feel better. I know I get a lot of criticism, and I know it could hurt SCLC, but I feel better, and I think that is the most important thing." He thought the war was so evil that he went on to say, quote, "I can no longer be cautious about this matter. I feel so deep in my heart that we are so wrong in this country, and the time has come for a real prophecy, and I'm willing to go that road." Well, this presents King with a real dilemma. Risk the support for a continuing moral campaign against the vestiges of segregation and injustice in the South and beyond, versus broadening or expanding that moral campaign to include the growing anti-war movement. In the very first session of this series, June 23rd, that's last year, I can't believe it's been that long, I laid out what I understood then and now to be the meaning of the phrase moral courage. The word moral means, quote, "of or relating to principles of right or wrong in behavior." And courage means mental or moral strength to venture, persevere, and withstand danger, fear, or difficulty. Certainly one can argue, and I did at the time, that removing injustice and segregation from our society would certainly be right behavior. And one can certainly argue, and I did then too, that ending a war one believes to be unjust is right behavior. King believed that both were right behavior because he was informed by his Christian faith. By 1967, King had already withstood many dangers, and he had few fears. He chose to venture publicly into the anti-war movement and to continue to persevere in his efforts with the civil rights freedom movement. He did so knowing the risks, and I believe this to be a major moral decision on his part, moral courage. Defying his staff, King agreed to address a large Vietnam protest rally at the United Nations Plaza in New York City. Knowing he was going to do this, his staff arranged for an event to occur, an address by King on April 4th, 1967, just before the protest at the plaza. And it was designed to be a comprehensive presentation of his Vietnam views to a prominent anti-war group called Clergy and Laymen Concerned About Vietnam, and it was occurred in New York City's famed Riverside Church. I'm sure on the internet or on YouTube you can find the actual address. I just wanted to show you, this is a poor quality picture, but it's a picture taken of him addressing a packed house. I think there were nearly 4,000 people there to hear this. And again, it was April 4th, so let me now quote King himself from that speech, because I think some of what he says here is not only eloquent, but is educational. He began this way: "I came to this magnificent house of worship tonight because my conscience leaves me no choice. I join with you in this meeting because I am in deepest agreement with the aims and works of the organization which has brought us together, Clergy and Laymen Concerned About Vietnam. The recent statement of your executive committee are the sentiments of my own heart, and I find myself in full accord when I read its opening lines. A time comes when silence is betrayal. The time has come for us in relation to Vietnam." The truth of these words is beyond doubt, but the mission to which they call us is a most difficult one. Even when pressed by the demands of inner truth, men do not necessarily assume the task of opposing their government's policy, especially in time of war. For those who ask the question, "Aren't you a civil rights leader?" and thereby mean to exclude me from the movement for peace, I have this further answer. In 1957, when a group of us formed the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, we chose as our motto to save the soul of America. We were convinced that we could not limit our vision to certain rights for black people, but instead affirm the conviction that America would never be free or safe from itself unless the descendants of its slaves were loosed completely from the shackles they still wear. In a way, we're agreeing with Langston Hughes, that black bard of Harlem who had written earlier, excuse me, "Oh yes, I say it plain, America never was America to me, and yet I swear this oath, America will be." Now, it would be incandescently clear that no one who has any concern for the integrity and life of America today can ignore the present war. If America's soul becomes totally poisoned, part of the autopsy must read Vietnam. It can never be saved so long as it destroys the deepest hopes of men the world over. So it is that those of us who are yet determined that America will be are led down the path of protest and dissent, working for the health of our land. This is a calling that takes me beyond national allegiances, but even if it were not present, I would yet have to live with the meaning of my commitment to the ministry of Jesus Christ. To me, the relationship of this ministry to the making of peace is so obvious that I sometimes marvel at those who ask me why I am speaking against the war. Could it be that they do not know that the good news was meant for all men, for communists, capitalists, for their children and ours, for black and for white, for revolutionary and conservative? Have they forgotten that my ministry is in obedience to the one who loved his enemies so fully that he died for them? What then can I say to the Viet Cong or to Castro or to Mao Zedong in China as a faithful minister of this one? Can I threaten them with death, or must I not share with them my life? The road that leads from Montgomery to this place, I would have offered all that was most valid if I simply said that I must be true to my conviction that I share with all men the calling to be the son of a living God. King went on to offer specific recommendations. He called for President Johnson, the government, to do certain things, but it was the first time that he put together a comprehensive statement. While King was pleased with his address, there was a barrage of negative newspaper editorials, beginning with the Washington Post. Listen to this editorial. King has done a grave injury to those who are his natural allies, and an even graver injury to himself. Many who have listened to him with respect will never again accord him the same confidence. He has diminished his usefulness to his cause, to his country, and to his people, and that is a great tragedy. More newspaper editorials and other news sources denounce King. At the White House, President Johnson's aides mobilized other civil rights leaders who supported the president, and that was most of them, and tried to isolate King's criticisms of the war. King's response to all these rebuffs was not to back off from what he had said at the Riverside Church. Rather, he was reminded of the distress he had felt when any of his nonviolent resistance campaigns began across the South. He is quoted as saying, "From President Kennedy on down, even the non-segregationists had opposed the disruption and protest, and no one had conceded any chance of a positive outcome. The press was against me. The middle-class Negro community was against me. But finally, they came around." And let me quote again a short passage from Branch's book. This was after he had given his Riverside Church speech, and it's in reaction to all the negativity by the press that followed. And he shows some anger here, I think. "They applauded us on the freedom rides when we accepted blows without retaliation," King declared with an edge of sarcasm. "They praised us in Albany and Birmingham and Selma, Alabama. Oh, the press was so noble in its applause and so noble in its praise that I was saying be nonviolent toward Bull Connor in Birmingham. His trademark passion, while quivering to defend a steady course, let slip rage at being patronized and understood. So King says further, there is something strangely inconsistent about a nation and a press that will praise you when you say be nonviolent toward a violent sheriff like Jim Clark, but will curse you and damn you when you say be nonviolent toward little brown Vietnamese children. King closes by saying there is something wrong with that. I'm going to stop this session at this point. There's just too much yet to happen in 1967 to complete that year in one session. So the next session, number 7 of the series, The Moral Courage of the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., will take us through the rest of 1967, including King's ongoing efforts in the anti-war movement and his organizing a new campaign called the Poor People's Campaign. Thank you for watching, and I hope you will join me in the next session.